My name is Tamar Segev. I grew up right outside Boston. I did my undergrad at Carleton College, which is a small liberal arts college in Minnesota, and lived there for a bit. And then I did my MFA at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Yeah, so I started taking art classes since I was a really small child. My mom's an artist, so she always put me in art classes, and I always knew it was something I loved. And then I knew it was something I was going to study in college. I always thought I would double major in something maybe more practical. But I had to do a thesis as a senior, and that's where I just really had time to focus on one project and really just paint for the whole semester. And I knew, I think, from then that I wanted to get my MFA and pursue it more seriously. So as an undergrad, really since I was a kid, I was always interested in drawing people. I always drew portraits of friends, family, self-portraits all the time. That's a lot of what I did in undergrad, was mainly figurative work. I had never painted until I got to college. I had done a ton of drawing in my life, but never touched oil paints until college, and really just fell in love with them and did these large-scale nudes I was really lucky. I was able to have models pose for me, like through the school or students, once a week, each for 3 hours. And then I also had a lot of friends that were willing to pose for me, mainly from photographs. So I had a mix of being able to paint from life and from photos for my thesis project. And they were all, large-scale nudes. And I was doing a lot of that mainly between, the 2 years between my undergrad and when I applied for my MFA. I applied, basically all figurative work for my MFA, and then slowly, pretty quickly actually, within the first year, just totally shifted. I think I love working with the figure, but I don't think I had something really specific that I wanted to convey with figurative work, and was definitely pushed in other directions, but I think it definitely benefited me. And while what I'm doing now is more abstract and very different, but I don't think I could have done it without having done a lot of the figurative work. Like the way that I kind of started painting flesh and people is very similar to, I'm painting these walls now, and it's very similar to that, even though the content is very different and the way it looks is very different. Part of the reason why I've always been drawn to figurative work is just I'm interested in people and their histories and stories and personal narratives, and that's really what I'm focusing on now. I'm just painting a different element of that and more of these structures that my family lived in, the buildings that they lived in, rather than the people themselves. But it's really it's about my life and their life, and a similar type of thing that I was interested in. The work in this exhibition was my thesis work from my MFA, and in 2019, in the summer of 2019, I traveled with my parents and my brother to Lodz, Poland, which is where my paternal grandparents are from. My it's my dad's parents, they're no longer alive, but they had been Polish Jews during the Holocaust, and both happened to be from Lodz, although they met elsewhere after the war, and had very kind of different stories. My grandfather was a little bit older. He was already in his 20s when the war started, and he escaped fairly early. And my grandmother was in the Lodz ghetto for the full 4 years, from 1940 to 44, and they were amongst the last Jews transported to Auschwitz. And so Lodz had I think it was the second largest Jewish population in Europe at the time, and the second largest ghetto, other than Warsaw being the largest one. But unlike Warsaw and other cities, it wasn't destroyed during the war. So when we went in 2019, most of the buildings are still there today. I mean, not all of them, but we were able to visit the apartment where my grandmother lived before the war, the one that her family owned, the apartment that my grandfather lived right before the war started. He actually had just gotten married and had a baby at the time, and so it was his first apartment. That was still intact. And then, of course, the building that my grandmother and her family lived for the 4 years of the ghetto, and that's Lemano Segev 48 is the address, which is most of the work here has that in its title, and we're able to walk into the entryway. It was open, and we weren't able to walk into the apartment itself, but that building is still intact, and it was a really poor neighborhood before the war, and of course during, and it still really is. The building's just completely falling apart, and so there's definitely important to know too, us sort of walking into that space was I definitely felt like a tourist coming into a space where now really Polish people are living there, but it's still a really impoverished neighborhood, and so there was that element to it. But it's really unique that we're able to actually experience the same structures, and so I was just really drawn to that space, and the paint in the entryway was just completely sort of peeling in some areas, and then it seemed like it was sort of put back on and then peeling again, and then sort of used to bandage the paint. And it was just all of these layers. There were scratches in it. Some felt really intentional. I kind of found these grid marks along the sides. There was just this really dense buildup of material accumulation on the walls. And so that's what I started to be really drawn to and focus on. And when I got back to my studio in Illinois, I started painting them. It took me a while to figure out sort of the way to paint them. I didn't start with that apartment. I actually started with just other spaces in the former Lodz ghetto. There's a lot of graffiti there. There's lots of stuff on the wall, lots of history, and so. But eventually, I kind of came to focus on the Monuskiego 48 as this sort of site where my family lived for 4 years, but so it has that personal connection. It also just sort of became this house or this structure that held all the memories that I had heard from, the things we were learning when we were in Lodz, the things I had heard from my dad growing up. I didn't have a particularly strong relationship with my grandmother, only because she lived in another country. We didn't speak the same language. And she's no longer alive, and similar with my grandfather, died when I was much younger. So there's always a bit of a disconnect there. I was always hearing more from my dad, if anything. And so this address, this place, kind of started to house all the memories. I was also doing research about it and kind of piecing things together. But of course, you can only sort of piece together so much and uncover so much. And so I started painting the wall in multiples times, and so that kind of each time was sort of like a return to the place, although not physically, but a return in each painting, so that I was extending the process of remembrance or remembering to each one. And so I think for viewers, there's obviously a rich history that they can learn about, but it's also about these active processes of remembrance, and it's not something that you can just stop doing. These aren't memorials to my family, but they're just records of kind of that process of remembering through different material ways. So in this work, I have they're constructed from these cut pieces of painted canvas for the most part, and they're stitched together, stitched onto a new canvas support. And so that kind of came out of just the walls themselves. When I first started painting them, there's all these areas of negative space on them where it just seemed like all the paint had just kind of fallen off. It was just completely bare. And I wasn't getting that in the painting, and I was really frustrated. So I just cut it up and in order to get that negative space. And then I ended up really liking it and saw the fragments as these sort of fragments of memory, and the negative spaces as gaps in memory. And then I started stitching them together for a few reasons. First, it like the act of stitching was a way to slow down my process. So with painting, it's really quick for the most part. Like I can paint kind of like, you can be kind of aggressive with the surface, a little bit frantic, you know, move around really quickly. I'm like scraping the paint, scratching into it. But with stitching, you have to be really still and calm, and it takes forever, and it kind of hurts your fingers, it hurts your back, it's uncomfortable. And I think that's important because it embodies that labor of remembering. There's a lot of labor to it, and the stitching seemed to embody that for me. And then it also went back to like a family history for me. So my Lodge had a really large textile industry before the war. That was the main industry, and actually both of my paternal grandparents separately worked in the textile factory. I think my grandfather, they had like an upholstery factory, and my grandmother's family, or they worked in an upholstery factory. My grandmother's family had like a storefront with some high-end fabrics, and my grandfather opened up a textile factory in Israel where they ended up and where my dad grew up. Since that was the skill that he knew. And my dad was the one who taught me to hand sew when I was a kid. And we had all these like scraps from my grandfather's factory in Israel. And I used to sew a lot when I was a kid too. And so there was sort of that history, but then that happened kind of before and after the war. But then during the war, my grandmother and her sisters, they were all teenagers, so they were young and healthy, and they were sent, I think they were in Auschwitz for like 6 weeks, and then they were sent to work in the Czech Republic, and 2 of them were in textile factories, so they actually were operating spinning machines, which, you know, spin cotton or wool into threads. So that had a really direct connection. That was how they survived too. I mean, partially just because they were able to leave Auschwitz, but also there were Czech women that worked there who treated them really nicely and gave them extra food, and they really appreciated, like to this day, what those women did for them. So there was that connection, and then I found that it was all stuff I knew, and then I found out sort of through my research and talking to family that my grandmother's youngest sister, Dorka, she actually worked in the Lodz ghetto. They worked in the children and adults, but they worked in factories, you know, making stuff for the Nazis. And she worked in a factory with other children where they were embroidering, and she embroidered like Nazi uniforms and also tablecloths and other things. But she had talked about how they would use for the uniforms these threads that were basically made out of metal, and that like at the end of the day her fingers would be bleeding, it'd be freezing too. It was Poland, and so that just became this really like I didn't know that until I had already started making this embroidery work, or this work where I'm using thread and stitching, and so that just became this really like visceral memory, and made it kind of painful to think about, but also added, I think, a really important layer of meaning to it.